Thank you all for being here. As I mentioned, this will be the last colloquium of the spring semester, so we're really thrilled to have you all here. I'm beyond thrilled to welcome Samara and Johanna from JustFix NYC, a nonprofit based in NYC that builds technology for aiding tenants and public housing issues. And we have our discussant, Daniel Waldinger from NYU. So Samara is a software engineer and a policy technologist. She has worked at the Aspen Tech Policy Hub, where she wrote policy recommendations for machine learning regulation. Samara also built city planning software, Sidewalk Labs, and Google Fiber. And she has a degree from computer science from Columbia University with a specialization in artificial intelligence. Samara is now at JustFix, where she writes software for public housing. Johanna is a lifelong Queens gal. She's a daughter of Peruvian immigrants and a tenant organizer, and she integrates her passion for transformative justice into all her work. Johanna co-founded the Astoria Tenant Union at the start of COVID-19 pandemic, utilizing the skills she gained from organizing in Inwood and Washington Heights to neighborhoods in New York while being at the Metropolitan Council on Housing. She graduated from Clark University with an honors degree in political science and urban development. So our discussion today will be moderated by Daniel Waldinger, who is a longtime member of MD4SG, one of the first to join our group. He's an empirical economist working at the intersection of market design, industrial organization, and public finance. His research focused a lot on the design of waiting lists for public housing and organ transplants. Daniel joined the NYU economics department as an assistant professor in fall 2019 after doing a postdoc at the NYU Furman Center. And he holds a PhD in economics from MIT and a bachelor's degree from University of Chicago. So thank you all for being here. Please add your questions in the chat or raise your hand. We're going to take questions after the talk and we'll have a discussion. We'll have a lot of time for discussion then. So thank you so much. And I'll let Samara and Johanna take it from here.
Thank you so much, Anna. Great to be here, and yeah, really excited to have. It's always great to be at places that I feel like really effectively merge technology conversations and policy or sort of social justice conversations. And yeah, we're going to be talking today about how we negotiate the different poles between, I think, a lot of the between both of those worlds that JustFix finds ourselves in, and talking about how technology, what the role technology should play in tenant organizing at JustFix. So I'm gonna hand it over to Johanna to talk about our mission.
Thank you. Welcome everyone. Thanks everyone for joining. I know that Anna told us that y'all are joining us from different parts of the world, so thank you so much for joining us at whatever time of day it is for y'all. So JustFix is kind of lives at this intersection similar to the space that y'all are in and have created together. So the mission of JustFix is to co-create technology with tenants, organizers, and legal advocates, mainly in New York, although we have also worked with advocates in California to build tools specifically to Los Angeles for Los Angeles tenants. And this is done with the goal of fighting displacement and achieving stable, healthy housing for all. And we believe that you can leverage the power of data and technology to support individuals. And specifically in this conversation, we'll be talking about how collective action can also be facilitated through the use of technology in order to achieve housing justice. So if y'all want to familiarize yourselves a little bit more with our product suite, since we won't be talking about all our tools, you can feel free to visit our site, justfix.nyc. We can drop the link in the chat. If you could do that for me, Samara, that'd be great. And yeah, now we're going to be talking a little bit about different theories of change and then presenting different case studies using the products that we have built, are in the process of potentially deprecating, and also future products, which is super exciting as well. So I'll pass it over to Samara to do a bit of an explainer of these different theories of change.
Awesome. So when I joined JustFix in 2021, pretty early in the year. And we were sort of still very much, we had built several tools very specifically for the pandemic to make sure that we could help people stay in their homes as there was this major public health crisis unfolding. And Johanna was going to go into a little bit more detail about what those tools look like. But we were sort of at this inflection point where we had a couple of tools that people were still using, and we knew we were going to need to support them up until the legal protections that they were associated with were phased out. But we also needed to be thinking about, what tools were going to bring us forward, and where did we want to sit in between this world of sort of housing courts, existing legal mechanisms that supposedly help people deal with unjust housing situations and injustices they face in the system. But we know from experience and from all of the excellent program and legal staff that we have, often don't bring people the kind of justice that they need or deserve. And so that was sort of one area that we knew was possible. We could work more with housing courts, but we weren't really sure if that was going to help bring people justice, or we knew that it wouldn't. Then we sort of talked about a second model that allows you to use, what are ways that you can use technology to kind of break down the system with the same tools that built the system. This is sort of our deputy director was like, this is sort of the breaking down the master's house using the master's tools kind of theory. But that's still, and that might be sort of relying on public data, on exposing information that is purposefully hidden from people in order to build collective action and try and change the system or chip away at a system that we view to be unjust. But that sort of still relies on there being a system that is going to continually provide you with open data or whatever it is and so the model 3 that we were talking about is when you can work entirely outside of a system. And we're going to go through some examples of products that we've built and that we're thinking about building that fit into each of these theories of change. And this was really relevant for us, like I said, as we were trying to figure out what were the next generation of tools that could bring us forward from sort of individual actions and system-focused actions to collective action and outside the system change. Great, so we can go to the next slide. So yeah, just a little bit more detail. We're going to go through each of these models in turn. So this is model 1, tools that work inside the system to bring more people or push as many people as possible through the system. Some goals here, if you want to click once, yeah, awesome. Goals could be to provide access to a previously inaccessible system. So Johanna's going to talk about this in a little bit. Actually, I'll briefly mention a tool that we're not going to talk in detail about, but we had a tool that would allow people to file an HP action, which in New York City is how you file a case against your landlord in housing court for failure to keep a standard living situation that's safe. And any way that your landlord has sort of broken housing laws, you can take your landlord to court. This requires working sort of with the housing courts. We put a lot of that system online to be able to have people file those actions against their landlords online. A collective goal, so that's an individual goal, right, is to try to give an individual access to a previously inaccessible system. The collective goal may be to flood the system so it has to pay attention to people who previously have been disenfranchised. So we know this previously was really hard. You have to serve papers at a certain time. You have to get things notarized. And we built a tool that allowed more people to file HP actions in New York City. And hopefully you can hope that might make the system pay more attention to people who it previously has disregarded. So some pros of this, there's more access to the system for traditionally oppressed people. Cons here is, as we talked about or touched on briefly, the system wasn't built to give, the housing court system was not built to give justice to people in a timely manner or in a way that is preserving of their dignity. And so you can leave off worse than when you started. You have to spend all this time and energy interfacing with a system that might not get you where you need to go. And we as the builders of the tool have very little control over when the tool becomes unusable. So in this particular case, like I talked about how we were able to put the system that needed notarization online. The courts suddenly started requiring in-person notarization again, which made it really impossible for people to use the tool that we had spent this time and energy building. And that was something we didn't have control over. That was a housing court decision. You can read more about that on our website. We have a whole Medium post on that if you want to learn more. So what are the mitigation mechanisms if you have to go with a Model 1 tool? you can provide support in entering the system, connections to lawyers. That's what we ended up doing when we deprecated the HP action tool. But it still felt like it wasn't really, that's sort of a stopgap measure. It wasn't really moving us in the direction that we wanted to be going in. So I will pass it over to Johanna to talk. Awesome, thanks for that link. To talk more specifically about another Model 1 tool that we built that is still ongoing today, and sort of analyze the effect of that one.
Thank you, Samara. So Model 1 products allow for individuals as well as collective folks, like as individuals, right, to be able to utilize. It's basically like supplementing the work that the government should be doing, right? Which is a lot of times what nonprofit, private sector organizations are put in a position to do, right? Due to the amount of funding that we may have access to, the amount of time, resources that may put us in a position where we can build this type of technology, especially at JustFix, where we our model is to build partnerships with folks that are working on the ground, doing tenant organizing, working with tenants on a day-to-day basis, in order to then see where there are gaps in the government system that technology can then be utilized to fill those gaps. Right, and this doesn't do anything really to disrupt the system. What it does is it allows for people to navigate the system with greater ease. So the first case study we'll be discussing a little bit is our eviction-free NY tool, and this specifically was a tool that we built in partnership with two New York State coalitions, Right to Counsel coalition, which there is a nationwide movement to ensure that tenants have a right to counsel in housing court. And in New York City, New York State is actually one of the first, in New York City particularly, it was one of the first cities, since this has to be passed through like a city council measure in our city. Is one of the first cities that has allowed for this to happen. And they're a coalition of a bunch of tenant organizations as well as legal advocates. And there is another coalition called the Housing Justice for All, which is an upstate, downstate coalition. And they more so work to organize tenants across the state of New York to pass statewide measures. And so these two coalitions, we worked with them to build this tool that what it does is what I stated, right, which is fill these gaps that exist in navigating government systems. And so during the pandemic, there was the passing of the COVID-19 Emergency Eviction Foreclosure Prevention Act, also referred to as SEPA, and this legislation was passed at a statewide measure, and what it allowed for folks to do was that if you can fill out a hardship declaration that stated that you either lost wages due to COVID-19, or if moving would be like a huge strain to your health, which like most people could apply for, right? You can just submit this hardship declaration to your the Office of Court Administration. And what this would then allow is for your landlord, if they wanted to start an eviction case against you in the future for not paying rent, you already had this protection that stated that I am not paying rent because of these reasons and I am protected. And so we worked closely with these two partners to build this product so that folks didn't have to send in a paper form, which is all that the Office of Court Administration was offering tenants, which was like a paper form in multiple languages. But a person still had to take on the responsibility of printing out the paper or going into their borough housing court to get access to a paper, and then sending it themselves, which could potentially be a cost that tenants would have to be burdened with, which they may not be able to, right? And so all these especially since our letters are sent through certified mail, and so a tenant is allowed to like have access to their tracking number, so that then they're able to like ensure that their letter is being received by the landlord, and also is directly emailed to the Office of Court Administration. And so this allowed for tenants to have easier access to navigate the system, right? Which is a clear example of a Model 1 tool. And so due to that, we had a great success. We were able to get over 20,000. I think the figure is actually much like a bit higher now. It's like, I think like 25,000 tenants across New York State to use our tool to fill out the New York State hardship declaration. But of course, due to this tool being just like a resource that tenants can use to be able to exercise their right that they have under the COVID-19 Emergency Eviction and Foreclosure Prevention Act. Once this piece of legislation expired, this tool goes null, right? And so this is where we hit this roadblock, where we like see the like caveats and limitations of building Model 1 products, right? All you're doing is really subsidizing the work that the government should be doing. And once you build a product that is attached to a certain piece of legislation and that legislation expires, your product also goes null. And so currently, if you were to visit evictionfreeny.org, you would see a pop-up that directs you to resources from our partners with more continuous updates, but you can no longer utilize this protection since the protection expired in January 15 of 2022. And so this is where we then have a discussion of how can we build then products that don't just subsidize government work, right? And can actually work at chipping away at the system, but still potentially rely on tools and resources that are offered to us by like potentially like what we call the system, right? Or like government agencies, right? And so the goal of a Model 2 product is to provide information previously and purposefully disguised by the system to groups or disenfranchised individuals. And as a collective goal, what this can then do is these concealed issues can motivate press coverage, grassroots action, policy change, and legislative reform, right? But you are still utilizing tools and databases, for example, like one that Samara mentioned before we even started, NYCDB, which is like a database of all these like open data resources that exist and are supplied to us by the government, right? Due to like transparency laws, anything like that, they supply us with that information, but it is once again not easy to access nor navigate as like a regular person that is just like trying to find out information about their living situation. And so the pros of it obviously are that there's little to no risk to an individual user to like gain information that they can then utilize to take action, right? It's a research product, right? Like also this product does not go null since it's continuously utilizing data that is going to be continuously collected. But obviously, if this relies on systems that are created by government agencies, we don't have a say if, like, for example, New York City at one point or New York State changes their laws around transparency and we no longer have access to that data, right? Or if, for example, there's limitations to the products because in reality, it's not actually facilitating that action item. What it's doing is encouraging potentially by giving you the power of knowledge, but in reality, it's not facilitating like the actual action element of it, which is necessary in order to create and transform change. So a product that we offer is Who Owns What? And Who Owns What is actually one of our most popular products. We actually recently released a new iteration of the tool, which was widely awaited for by our partners. And Samara will be talking a bit about the new features that we provide. But the main purpose of Who Owns What is to unveil property ownership. And in New York City in particular, New York City is used oftentimes by folks that like study housing anywhere in the world as a case study because we have the largest concentration of renters in this country, and as well we like have like this like there's like all the examples of like real estate, particularly using their power in order to gain as much like profit as possible, right? And so housing is turned into a business commodity, is turned into a profiteering business, and this in order to ensure that like there is not as much action taken against individuals. There are a lot of like LLCs, corporations, like veiling of property ownership that has happened in New York City the past few decades. We actually just released a report yesterday written by our research and policy manager and data lead and engineer, which we can also like share with y'all about this like phenomenon. But what Who Owns What does is it provides a snapshot of the current conditions and recent history around a given building, and also the associated properties to that building, building out a portfolio of buildings. And so what this does is it provides a tool, like uses these databases that are available through open data, and just organizes it in a way that's like easy for folks to digest and use, and also to pinpoint what we would characterize in the tenant organizing world as targets, right? Who is your target in a situation when you are living in a building that is potentially being purchased by a corporation, and is also buying up the rest of the buildings in your neighborhood? Who is that person behind that, right? And who can we target in order to mitigate, right? And potentially take on collective action to do something. And so Who Owns What, of course, like makes it easier for you to like have this landlord information, to see which buildings are owned by shell companies and LLCs. But of course, there's limitations, as I said, right? We are only able to display buildings that require HPD, which is our city housing enforcement agency. Only the buildings that are registered are the ones that we can use, right? And there are stipulations to like who has to be registered and who doesn't. So for example, property owners of residential buildings are only required by law to be registered if it's a multiple dwelling, which means it's like 3 or more residential units, or a private dwelling that has 1 to 2 residential units, and where neither the owner nor the owner's immediate family resides in them. And then in addition to that, there is not as much enforcement by HPD or any of the other agencies in order to ensure that there is proper registration of the buildings, even if they are required. Like, for example, I live in a building in Astoria that has about like 30 units and is a rent stabilized building, which means that it should be regulated, and it does fit under the qualifications to be registered. But if I were to look up my building on Who Owns What, my building hasn't been registered since 2019, right? And so there's not as much enforcement, so we can only provide data that is like reported by the city and required by the city, but without enforcement, there's limitations to the amount of research that you're able to have access to. And so I'm going to pass it over to Samara to talk a little bit about how we've iterated on this tool and like use other methods in order to like allow for there to be more elements of more visualization of these portfolios in a more accurate way, potentially.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe. Yeah, so this is an opportunity to just do a little bit of a technical deep dive or mini deep dive on the new update to Who Owns What that we have been working on for a while. So previously, Johanna mentioned that a lot of landlords sometimes don't register their buildings. A lot of the time, also, they'll register their buildings under slightly different names, slightly different spellings of the same name. That can also be clerical error for whoever is typing that into the system, because there's definitely still paper forms that people use to register their buildings. And so the data that you're visualizing is only as good as, or the tool is only as good as the data that you're visualizing, as I'm sure everybody here would attest. So we used to just use, it would take an address that's like where you start on Who Owns What, is you give in one address in New York City, and then we would find the person who had been registered to that as the owner of that building if it was registered, and we would see any other buildings that exact same string of an owner said that they had also owned, right? So we were doing matching on landlord name. This is sometimes difficult, especially if you have names that are really similar to each other. There are, homonyms, people have the same name, they might be a different landlord. And that was causing not only some confusion if you had sort of, the same name and different portfolios, but it was also, depending on which address you searched, you might get a totally different group of addresses based upon how that particular spelling of the name was associated with addresses. So say like Johanna register, God forbid she's not a landlord, but if you were, we would say, one of them is registered to Joe and one of them is registered to Johanna. And Joe owns 3 buildings and Johanna owns 5 buildings. Those would be different based upon which address you search, right? If you happen to get one of those portfolios. So our most recent update to the, we used the NetworkX graphing library to do some different analysis, and we started associating things by business address. So if you have totally different names, totally different spellings, as long as there's a business address that 2 landlords have in common, we're going to group those together into the same portfolio and show that to you in a much more like connected graph of sort of landlords. And the cool thing is we're not only doing that one level deep. Say like Johanna has address A and Joe has address A and address B. We're going to now go and look at address B and see if there are any other landlords that Johanna also that sort of shared that business address with Johanna, and then we'll keep going basically until we find the end of the completely the set that is sort of distinct and unique and disjoint from all other sets. So that means that any address, you've built up in some cases quite large portfolios from everybody who has shared a business address at some point. And that allows you to have a much better sense of historically maybe which landlords have worked together or have shared business offices, even if they're not, like exactly the same bank account that's financing all of these. It allows you to, any address that you search will give you the same portfolio every time. So that helps researchers to be able to trust our results, in addition to making sure that organizers have the ability to identify potential targets and have a fuller grasp of how, especially management companies and also groups of landlords sort of work together. A lot of landlords will say like, oh, I only own 2 buildings. And you can clearly see that they might have, registered it under their spouse's name or somebody else's name, but they definitely have much larger portfolios than that. Happy to answer more questions about that at the end and talk more about the tech, but that was sort of our main process there. Cool. This is a little bit more information. This is what the actual graph visualization looks like. You can see that there's sort of multi-step. You can do some interesting graph analysis on these kinds of things, like finding the longest path and stuff to figure out what the greatest degree of separation between landlords is. But we can keep going on there. We also added, this was like a major requested feature, was search by landlord name. Previously, we didn't have that. And it was going to be hard to do, string matching and that kind of stuff. The nice thing here is because we're associating all names that are associated with one portfolio, you can start typing any name, any spelling into this search engine, and you'll be guaranteed to get back the entire portfolio that might have the same name misspelled multiple times and a couple of different names, and you'll get the same portfolio. And that's just a pretty simple lookup table, where we cluster things together into like a hash map type deal. Okay, awesome. So that's who owns what. We talked about how it relies on open data sets, and the goal is to inform people so that they could take collective action, they could get in touch with their neighbors, they could understand more about the overall landscape, and it can help inform organizers. But it still does rely on a lot of information that is provided by government systems, that if we started losing access to that tool might become in jeopardy. So we're going to move on to talk about model 3. And this is the area I will say that's the least, we've done the fewest tools in this area. We're still sort of figuring out what this would look like. But we're gonna, feel free to give us some ideas here as we go. So the goal of, Model 3, our deputy director likes to say, what system? Like, I don't see any system here at all. And the goal is to stay out of, resist the system as much as possible, and not use resources or rely on government resources to build any tools. Obviously, a pro here is that the tool can operate more independently. You don't have to worry about your data sources going away. No reliance, or limited reliance rather, on systems of oppression. Obviously, we all still live in society. The cons here are the system can and does confer benefits, right? Tangible results or information on individuals and families. And sure, a lot of people may need those benefits to survive. Whether or not that's sort of like the most just perfect world that we ever want to see doesn't, is irrelevant. People need those things. You can't sort of completely discount the fact that people are still going to need to interact with the system in some ways. So one example here, and this is not what we're necessarily building, but it's sort of an example. I would love to hear other people's sort of ideas of things that could fit into this category. We talked about anarchist models of resistance, like tools to help stop an eviction through force. So if a tech tool that helps a bunch of people show up to, physically prevent a marshal from evicting a family in real time. This is something that obviously a lot of tenant protection groups in New York organize themselves. Would it be this sort of tool would be more on the people side and less on the technology side? It's all about how do you coalesce people power in order to work outside the system. So that's one sort of example of this idea. And I'm going to go on to talk about a new product idea that incorporates a lot of ideas from Model 3. You could definitely argue that it still also has some ties to Model 2, but I'm interested to hear what people think about. A lot of these aren't super clear cut. So if we go to the next slide, problem here, we have talked about, Joe has mentioned the 2019 rent laws, and we've worked a lot with people who are current tenants in New York who already have housing and who maybe need to make sure that they stay in their housing, preventing evictions, and making sure that they're not paying more in rent than they should be if they are rent stabilized. And we haven't done a lot for people who are seeking housing, right? People who are trying to move, trying to get housing for the first time, people who are currently unhoused. And Who Owns What does a little bit of that by allowing you to look up your landlord to see whether or not your landlord has any violations that have been filed against them. But in a lot of cases, you're also going to have to work with a broker, and brokers have a bunch of things that they're not allowed to ask you. According to the 2019 rent laws, you're not allowed to ask about prior evictions. You're not allowed to charge an application fee. You can't charge more than $20 for a background check. And you're not allowed to ask for a security deposit that's more than 1 month's rent. But plenty of brokers still break these laws and still ask for these things. And it's sort of up to you as an individual to know your rights here. So this is a case where there's a government agency that's supposed to go after brokers who are breaking the law. In this case, we know they're not either staffed nor do they have the incentive to try and get every single bad actor broker here. So what are ways that we can work outside the system to name and shame brokers in order to prevent or to try and sort of shift them away from asking for these illegal pieces of information or illegal amounts of money? One idea that we had is we could we've published before a list of worst evictors. We could publish a similar worst brokers list if we had evidence in the shape of a rental application that specifically asks for those pieces of information or requires a certain amount of fees. So we were like, okay, how do we get a bunch of rental applications? We were like, okay, we're all going to go and apply for apartments all throughout the city, and then we'll have examples of these rental applications. And I think pretty soon we're like, okay, this is probably not going to be either potentially not ethical, also potentially not feasible we have a staff of like 10, 12 people to try to get examples of rental applications across the whole city. So they're not public information. Brokers don't need to post rental applications online. And one idea that we had was to start crowdsourcing these rental applications. And if you're like, great, like you're applying for a new apartment, upload a copy of your rental application to our tool. But why would somebody do that? What's in it for them? And the second idea here is that users get a walkthrough of their rental application with advice on how to advocate for their rights if a broker is breaking the law. In a lot of cases in New York, individually, if any one person tries to push back against one of these things, the market currently is pretty hot, and a lot of people, you'd probably just lose the apartment. But that's the whole goal here, is to have multiple, a large number of people and a groundswell of people advocating for their rights by providing this information to people about what they're allowed to insist on. And that could help the tide change for everybody. It's only a collective action. It'll only work if it's a collective action kind of thing. And so in this case, we said, if we could walk people through and say, here's what you should do, like tell everybody to sort of push back against brokers who are asking for illegal information, then as an individual, I get a payoff because I have been informed of my rights, and I can sort of potentially shame my broker individually into doing the right thing. But I'm also paying it forward into this bank of rental applications that we as JustFix could either publicize, we could make a worst brokers list, we could name and shame the brokers in a much more sort of collective way. And that is, I'll go through sort of, this is a better breakdown here of the different steps. So you'd upload your rental application, take pictures and upload it. It's a blank application, so don't, add it. There's no personal identifiable information here. Get guided through it page by page. We'll sort of ask you if you see these things on the page and be like, actually, that's a red flag. Like your broker should not be allowed to ask you that. Then that's it for the user side of things. The user has gotten their information. They know what they can do in that particular broker situation. Then we take over. We start building this database of rental applications. And many of the worst brokers are also the largest. So you don't need a lot of examples of applications in order to have an example that is going to cover most of the city. We can publish this worst brokers list that we just talked about, a list of bad brokers with specific notes about what the illegal information they ask for is. We can use screenshots from the rental applications. And then the goal here is that the power shifts, right? Brokers are scared of being named. We get a lot of people who are very sad and scared to be on our worst evictors list every year. It's definitely not, it does create some pressure, I would say. And ideally, you get a groundswell of brokers changing their applications to stop asking for illegal information, which obviously they should have done anyway. But this is sort of a sort of crowd justice way of trying to bring change when there isn't a government agency that can step in and do all this for us at the scale that's necessary. And then this also could be a place where tenants could gain power by sharing this information with each other. And that's sort of more of the Model 2 situation. Great. I'm going to pass this back to Johanna to wrap up our conclusion. We've talked about Model 1, Model 2, and Model 3. Please, think of questions. Happy to go into detail. I know we rushed through. We have a lot of products, so thanks for bearing with us.
Yeah, so of course. So like Samara stated, this Model 3 idea and like the fact that we haven't really built a lot of products within Model 3 is due to the fact that Model 1 and Model 2 products can be easier to build by technology, right? It doesn't rely on people as much, crowdsourcing, the element of ensuring that there is a collective as a part of the process, right? And so our goal with building technology is to facilitate tenant organizing, which means that the product and the power does not exist within the product in and of itself or the person's user experience, but within the people themselves, right? And so how do we use technology to potentially allow for folks to have the tools to shift this power imbalance that exists between landlords and tenants? And so with Model 1, right, there's no solution within the product at all. It doesn't shift power by any means, right? By providing folks with the ability to fill out these hardship declarations, you don't empower tenants with an ability to shift the power imbalance between their identity as a tenant and a landlord. It just allows them to be able to use the system with more ease, right? with Model 2, there isn't also a shift in power because there is the product in and of itself exists to provide information, like who owns what, or even other products like mentioned that were mentioned. I guess we didn't mention any other ones for Model 2, but for Model 2, other products that exist that are similar to who owns what, right, that like allow for, they don't necessarily have like an end goal, right? They just exist as a means to expose information, to organize information, as an educational tool, as a resource. But it's the product in and of itself does not actually lead to an action, right? Model 3, the goal is the action, right? And that action may not exist within the product, right? The example that Samara provided, the goal is not to just build this like worst brokers list or even like the technology to crowdsource, but what will be a product of the crowdsourcing, right? The product of the crowdsourcing allows for us to like create a database that is not existent within like any government agency, within any like quote unquote system. It's like a collective of folks that are like choosing to empower themselves by uploading this application to then ensure that they're not being unjustly rejected or having a violation of their human rights by like being discriminated against through these rental application processes. And then through that database, right, that is not connected to anything, like we have the power to ensure that this database continues to exist, be able to then uncover the injustices that exist within our system. And then the goal is, of course, to build that power from outside, right? And so, and then ensure that people understand like what is actually happening and how these injustices manifest, right? And so we really are working towards ensuring that our products more so lean towards a Model 3, but of course know that our role doesn't even really exist within this Model 3, right? As not being an organization that does tenant organizing. I think especially as a person that didn't come from the tech world, I understand that like organizing is the goal, right? And that cannot be done through technology, but technology can be a key resource in it. And I urge like other folks that are doing similar types of work to think of that as well, right? How are you integrating people power into the work that you're doing? Because that's really where the solution lies for many, and if not all, our injustices that exist in the world, is empowering people and ensuring that they have the tools necessary to shift this imbalance of power that exists. And for our situation, it's between landlords and tenants. For your situation, maybe be between doctors and patients, between like banks and like people who like are like have like accounts in their bank or like do banking or whatever. And so we thank you all for like listening through all of our discussions on different models and case studies. And we want to open up for questions or comments. And I think also Daniel may say something. I'm not sure. So I'll pass it back to facilitator, a moderator.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Joe and Samara. Actually, how much I say is going to depend on time constraints. So Anna, do we have a hard stop at 2, or we go past that?
We usually go until 15 past, and
Okay.
we can stay until then. We can go a few minutes after. Usually the colloquium is 1 hour and 15 minutes. So please don't feel constrained by the time.
I will say, I'll try to talk for just a few minutes, give a little bit of maybe broader context about affordable housing policy in the US and kind of a different way of framing what you guys are doing. And then we'll do questions. So I think that like, just in terms of kind of like what's happening in the world right now, we just had a pandemic and housing just got way more expensive across most of the country. But, you know, even before the pandemic, there was a brewing affordable housing crisis in most of the country. More and more neighborhoods and cities were just becoming unaffordable to large segments of the population. And this COVID really accelerated this trend and highlighted some of the tension between landlords and tenants in this rental relationship. But these existed before, and the problems were getting worse. So, why, from a society's perspective, if we don't, want to take, even if we don't want to take the point of view of tenants in particular, we might worry about this crisis for a number of reasons. For one thing, it has a big impact on poverty, right? So if low-income households are spending most of their money on rent, they don't have much left for other necessities. And the affordable housing programs we do have, like public housing and vouchers, they're not provided to everyone who's eligible. They're actually rationed explicitly because of the way the policies are designed. So that's one concern, that it exacerbates poverty. In addition, if people are living in substandard housing, that itself can cause health problems, other problems. And there's been a lot of attention, especially in the last 5 to 7 years, towards housing instability. So eviction, homelessness, and sort of the institutions like housing court that produce those outcomes. In the background here, there's also a lot of concern that the impacts of these problems are not even by race, ethnicity, gender, right? So for example, low-income Black mothers are the ones who get evicted at the highest rates. So I think that one interesting thing that happened during the pandemic, right, as you guys were developing JustFix, was that suddenly the balance of power actually changed quite a bit, at least in the short term. So, there was an eviction moratorium which varied in length and scope across states, but, was completely unprecedented. You couldn't just evict a tenant for not paying rent the way that you could during normal times. Now, we're dealing with the reverse transition. How do we, transition back to a world where landlords can evict tenants, but many tenants are still struggling? There was also a huge amount of rent relief provided to try to ease that transition. And I think it seemed to me, at least, that tenant organizing grew a lot. Like rent strikes became a lot more common, and there was just a lot more energy behind kind of like the tenant advocacy side. So the second thing I want to say with that kind of like broad context is that New York City is a really interesting and kind of like intense housing market to be working in for a number of reasons. So I think, as Joe mentioned, it's, first of all, it's one of the most expensive housing markets in the US. Sometimes San Francisco is more expensive, but basically those are the two top ones. A large share of households are renters. It's 2/3 in New York City compared to 1/3 nationwide. So all of these concerns about high rent burdens, especially for the low income, are especially strong in New York. And in New York, there are a lot of evictions. So before the pandemic, there were more than 200,000 being filed each year. Not all of them led to actual forced moves, but being evicted itself is quite problematic. New York also has very strong tenant protections, I think, by national standards. So that doesn't mean, you guys have, I think, highlighted many issues with the current system, but if you looked at sort of how hard is it to evict a tenant who isn't paying rent, or how many resources are there for tenants who think they aren't being treated fairly by their landlord, New York is actually doing pretty well compared to a lot of the country. So eviction court takes a long time. New York City rolled out this right to counsel program that guarantees eviction representation for low-income defendants. And there are even stronger bills being debated right now. So I think one thing that's maybe not on the table anymore, but was for a while, is a good cause eviction bill that would even cover market rate units. New York City also has a lot of rent regulation. That's something that distinguishes it from many other cities. So most buildings that were built before 1970 are rent stabilized. So the units that are still subject to that, the owners can only raise the rent by a certain amount that's determined by a politically appointed board every year. When you look at all the units that are either rent stabilized or rent controlled in some other way, that actually accounts for more than half of the rental units in New York City. That's very different than a lot of cities. Actually, many states have outlawed rent control. An important thing to know about rent control, though, it's not just that you can't raise the rent. It also comes with stronger protections for tenants. So the landlord can't just get rid of a tenant they don't like if the tenant is paying the rent complying with their lease. So that's, there's a right to renew for tenants. And the other thing is that New York City just has a ton of state and local subsidy programs that are not just the federal public housing and voucher programs that you have in most cities. So because of all of this, that housing is really expensive, it's highly regulated, and there's just a huge ecosystem of political and legal advocacy surrounding landlord and tenant issues in New York City that is pretty unique. There are very few cities, I think, in the US that have a comparable amount of energy devoted to housing issues. And that means that there's a huge amount of contention over the division of surplus that in some ways naturally favors owners, right? So I mean, owners are often professionals, they have a lot more resources, they own more units. So the cost of dealing with like a tenant you want to evict or maintenance issues is just the fixed cost is much smaller, and landlords tend to know how to navigate the system. So even a system that is relatively tenant friendly, at least by national standards, can have a lot of inequality, right? So I'm just going to give a couple examples of kind of like what I think of as basic sources of inequality that are built into the system. And then I'll stop there. One thing is that when you think about how much accountability do landlords have? And how much accountability do tenants have? There's actually a well-developed reputation system for renters, right? So if you want to rent a new apartment, landlords can look at your credit history. They can look at your criminal background. They can see if you've been evicted. They can ask you for employment, salary information. There isn't a comparable system for landlords. And part of, I think, what Who Owns What and the Worst Evictors modules are trying to do is create a reputation system for landlords. And provide some incentives to basically balance out that inequality. Another source is just that owners will systematically document rent charges and payments. So they naturally have documentation for the main reason why tenants get evicted, which is non-payment of rent. But there isn't kind of the same documentation system for ways landlords might violate their lease and not uphold their side of the bargain. And I think like the letter of complaint tool, the hardship declarations, those are, I think, partly lowering the cost of navigating the system for tenants and maybe leveling the playing field if you get taken to housing court. And the last thing is that, just because a law is on the books, like for example, rent regulation really limits how much, owners can raise the rent, but not all owners go by the rules. And, the agencies charged with enforcing the rules might not release the data that would let you catch people who are breaking the law. They may not go after them themselves.
That's actually another tool that we've been thinking about. Happy to go into that if
well,
people want.
Be cool to talk about. So, this idea of like the rent history online forum that, lets you ask whether your apartment's been rent controlled and what the rent's been, that's one tool that helps with this. That's basically using the reporting that the agencies are supposed to be doing. DHCR is supposed to get back to you with your rent. And then, the idea of crowdsourcing rental applications, I view as something similar. This could be a way of either explicitly catching discrimination or just kind of shedding light on something where landlords might be doing something bad, but we wouldn't know because no one is systematically tracking this. So I guess I would view what you guys are doing as just various ways of shifting the balance of powers in this system that's kind of like already highly regulated, highly complex, and has also changing a lot, as you guys have mentioned. So I think that's all I'm going to say. Let me open the floor to questions. So it looks like there was one question in the chat. I don't know, Lauren, do you want to like restate part of your question? It looks like Samara already answered it to some degree.
Sorry, that was not in response to the question. That was
okay.
In response to something that you had said. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no licensing requirements, right? So Lauren, do you want to ask it again? I can also just state your question and we can take it from there. Okay, I'll ask it. So Lauren asks, what are the ways you are engaging with people to use the tools? So how do you scope and understand the representation and demographics of your constituents? Basically, are you getting the most needy people to use these tools, people who really need them? How do you know?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we actually, the reason why one of our main things that we talk about is like a co-creation process is because we mainly work to create our tools and iterate on them due to like the feedback provided by partners, and the partners that we work with are folks that are tenant organizers working in neighborhoods, and their mission aligns with ours given the demographic of folks that they work with closely. And so we work with organizations around the city that mainly focus on working with tenants that are low income and tenants of color. And so that's how we are able to distinguish like who is using our tools, but we are working on expanding on that more. We have actually expanded our team a bit this year, thankfully, since we are still like pretty much a startup. We have expanded our team and have hired a user researcher to develop more so our demographics of who our users are and to get a better picture to ensure that our products are being utilized mainly by folks that we are like building our tools for, given that there is a bit of like a lot of our use of some of our products is actually by the city themselves. Like one of our products, like Who Owns What, is actually one of our biggest users is actually HPD, like the city agency. And so we want to ensure that our products are actually being used by the folks that we intend the product to be used for by. But we also do that by continuously iterating on the tool to ensure that it is highly accessible. That is a foundation that was built by our lead engineer to ensure that the product is accessible regardless of the software that you like use your phone, like the OS operating system that your phone has, your computer has, to ensure maximum accessibility of the tool regardless of the product that you're using the tool on.
Yep, and I'll also add there, and that extends obviously to accessibility if you're using a screen reader, if you're using any other assistive device, and also if you don't have a lot of bandwidth. These are just the engineering side of things. And then one other way that we, this is an example of sort of using problematic tools to help hopefully a better cause. We do marketing, right? We buy ads on Facebook and plenty of other places that do have problematic targeting practices, and also in this particular case are potentially going to help us get to people that should see it.
Cool. Let me see, does anyone else want to raise their hand now? You can also just unmute yourself and start talking. All right. Well, given the length of that silence, I have a question I'd like to ask you guys. This is a research community, so I was particularly curious, like you mentioned one kind of technical tool you guys use, which is like all various network analysis, machine learning tools. Are there any areas or technical problems where you've kind of realized you needed a solution, either like a way to think about the problem or just a tool to solve it, and you found the research like totally lacking?
Yeah, it's a good question. One of the technical questions that was brought up when we were talking about the like rent application crowdsourcing, previously we haven't had to store, the only user data that we store is textual information. We haven't had people upload photos or anything that was present on a previous iteration of the tool. But obviously, if you're going to ask people to upload pictures of things, you start opening yourself up to a lot of potential for abuse or just sort of unhelpful images, right? Like we talked about whether it's possible to OCR a lot of the images of rent histories, whether you could sort of build an easy like template that would recognize a rent history or a rent application. And yeah, I started looking into that. I think that those tools obviously exist. I'd be interested if people want to send us links to some GitHub libraries and repos that y'all have used for that kind of stuff in the past. But I think a lot of the sort of like moderation, how do you make sure that people are uploading, not trolly content, and how do you make sure that moderation is just sort of a general human problem. I think we've also talked about, a lot of the work that I had done previously to working at JustFix was more on this sort of also housing, but sort of on the mortgage discrimination side of things. And there you have a lot of algorithms that are being used to decide whether or not people get a mortgage and at what price. Similarly, there's a lot of algorithms that are currently used by landlords for tenant screening. And that's another area that's like in a lot of ways ripe for I mean, definitely right for discrimination, happens all the time. And in some ways, like landlords are not supposed to be able to use that information, or they're not supposed to be able to use the outcome that includes protected information, but there aren't a lot of easy ways of telling whether or not a landlord has done that. So there's, I mean, I would love to be able to sort of like, write something to troll tenant screening algorithms and be able to render them useless, but or outlaw them. But that is not a technical solution that I've come up with yet.
I have a question, maybe a little bit related to that. I'm trying to formulate it in my head, right? But I know there's a bunch of algorithms that you, Daniel, know more about in terms of like public housing allocation mechanisms. And I wonder if there's any relationship between the tech tools that we can build for like a collective action or gaining information about the tenants that could be used to aid into some of these algorithms. I know for my limited information was that, for example, it's some of them like deter people from applying who might otherwise be eligible, or some of the waiting lists might be a bit longer than people would expect. And I'm wondering what can we reappropriate in terms of like technology or algorithms to aid them? And if any of you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's actually an area where it's prudent to be like pretty worried about the use of algorithms to decide who gets public housing, for example. A lot of the work that we've talked about has not been public housing, right? We're talking in New York City, that's the New York City Housing NYCHA, that's the NYC Housing Authority. And there's a lot of things that tenants that live in like market rate or rent stabilized buildings, not city owned buildings, can do to help with their situation that NYCHA tenants don't have access to. Like, anyway, Joe could talk more about that. But I think that there's a lot of, I would be really worried to see the selection process for public housing or for lottery housing be sort of handed off to like a third party algorithm. There's not currently enough protections at the city level to make sure that third party companies have to disclose information about the algorithms that they're developing. At the federal level, there actually used to be, in the last administration, there was a regulation that they tried to get passed to make any company that uses a third-party algorithm not liable for the discrimination that algorithm perpetuates. So obviously, like, we could do better in New York City, but I think I mean, we've talked about, this is sort of like, the transparency and things that I think that I think like I've spent a lot of time both on the sort of institutionally, how do we make things fairer? And then also in a non-institutional and collective organizing way, how do we sort of marshal resources? And I think the question of who has access to build the algorithm and who has access to all the inputs and transparency about it. I have not seen a single situation currently where, like, a government used an algorithm that was fully accessible and transparent to everyone and easily understandable. And I guess that's part of it. There may be an extra follow-up question there. I'm sure that y'all have probably thought about this as well, but.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I know that, like, in New York, there's this task force that thinks about how algorithms are being used in public spaces. And from what I hear, they have also a lot of trouble in defining, like,
what is an algorithm?
What is the algorithm? How do we use it? And I think there's enough work there to figure that out before we use them. Yeah.
Right. But I think one thing that I did sort of some of my research suggested is making sure that you have at least some kind of fairness check that's an algorithm itself that's going to try and prove whether or not a proposed algorithm is fair based upon some very clear statistical definition of fairness. And if you're going to have an algorithm making important decisions about people, and it's going to change often, you definitely make sure that you have an auditing or an automated auditing process that is sort of visible to everybody, and when it fails, everybody can see that, and that's got to be it's got to keep up with how fast it changes. Okay, next question. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I'll say one quick thing or two actually on that. One is that I think that, in terms of transparency, I would say that there's a major transparency issue with the way all housing authorities process applications right now. Like tons of, they publish like very detailed documents about sort of like what their policies are, but there's actually a lot of discretion and unclear sort of like how reliably those rules are implemented. That can be good or bad, rules versus discretion, there's always a trade-off. But I think that there's a lot we don't know about what housing agencies are actually doing when they allocate housing. And it seems like something that you might be able to crowdsource in a similar way that you'd crowdsource like rental applications or, maintenance problems with existing units. So I don't know, maybe you guys could work on a tool to ask people, how long have you been on the NYCHA wait list? And
12 years.
Did you get rejected? Yeah. Okay, so we have a question from MLE0050. Sorry that I don't.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Oh, I think you're on mute.
Oh, Michael, you should go ahead. I think you're on mute.
Yeah, it didn't work. Now it worked. All right. Yeah. I agree with a lot of the concerns that Samara pronounced. Is that pronounced right? Has about algorithms. So I share all of those. But what makes this complicated is that people also, like how we make decisions, aren't always transparent. Like explainability and transparency also applies to human decision-making and cognitive stuff. And so it seems to me that the issue, and I wonder how you techie folks think, I'm a sociologist and social worker, how you techie folks think about this, is the issue is like, sort of how do you combine, I guess, these two different decision-making processes, humans and algorithms, in a way that can best make decisions in a fair way, given that both can lack transparency, be unexplainable. And I mean, if that's clear, how do you think about that in your field?
Yeah, happy to take this. Joe, do you want to say anything first? Okay. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that's sort of, ends up, a lot of these discussions sort of come down to this sort of crux of like, which one is better? And obviously I think there's, there's the thing that we have now, and then there's whatever we might adopt in the future. Anything we adopt in the future has got to be better than what we have now, first off, right? Second off, I think, the question of, I think you hit it on the head, how do we define fairness it sort of comes back to that sociological question, not a technical question, but a sociological question of what would we consider to be fair allocation of housing? And some of the work that I did at Aspen was listing out, when we say legal fairness in housing discrimination and employment discrimination, we talk about disparate impact or disparate treatment, right? Those are sort of the two ways that we talk about. If you're treating people the same, then that's fair, versus if the outcome is the same for people, then that's fair. And this is obviously, not a solved idea. We don't all agree on what we think should be the case in all cases. There currently disparate impact, is something I think is a much more useful mechanism, but that doesn't always match up with the technical definitions of fairness that you would need if you wanted to use a machine learning algorithm or a neural net or some kind of thing on important decisions that learn from past data. And, we're not even talking necessarily about algorithms that learn from past data that is, racist data that includes redlining, our vast sort of legacy of discrimination in housing in this country and in many other countries, I'm sure. But the question of whether there's one definition of fairness that I particularly like a lot that I would be happy to sort of share more about, but it's whether or not there's sort of an existing one that's kind of like, would two people who are similarly situated get the same result? If this is in the mortgage concept, if everybody has the same amount of money in their bank account and they have the same history of paying back rent, would those two people get the same mortgage terms, regardless of what their zip code, their demographic information, that kind of thing. And there's one that is called, wow, I'm like really dredging back my research now, but basically the algorithm makes the same number of mistakes for all demographic groups, and not just mistakes in general, but the same number of positive, like false positives and false negatives for all groups. So that's the same number of people who were unfairly denied housing and the same number of people who were unfairly given housing in a crude sort of formulation of this problem. Those numbers have to be equal for every single demographic group that we care about, sort of talking about as a protected group. That's a way of talking about this, this kind of thing. Equalized odds is the name of that particular statistical definition of fairness. But that's a legislation choice, right? Is that the kind of fairness that we're looking for out of our algorithms? And once we pick, the good thing is once you pick a definition of fairness, then we can write an algorithm to try and enforce that, right? We can try and ping these decision-making algorithms constantly and run tests on them, and they can be a little bit more transparent, but we got to figure out what we're going for.
All right, anyone else want to ask a question? Should we call it here, Anna? I have a lot more questions I could ask. Maybe we should stop here and then people can stick around if they want to.
Sounds good. I'm going to stop the recording and the live stream, and we can stay for a few more minutes for questions. And in the meantime, if anyone needs to drop off, feel free to do so. And thank you so much for coming.